Welcome to Winning with Data-Driven Marketing Podcast. This podcast is brought to you by was.ai Market Research. I'm Julie, your host in this podcast, and in every single episode, we talk to industry leaders, marketers, and growth experts in Asia about how they use data to enhance the ROI in their marketing activities. We bring you real case studies while giving you background on how these leaders built their career to where they are today. Joining me today is Henrik Petersen, a fractional CMO who has over 20 years of experience in B2B marketing for software companies such as Zendesk and Microsoft. Henry is now also the CMO of Brand2B, who work with startup founders, executives to deliver sustainable and profitable growth. Now, for those of you who have been following our podcast, you'll be no stranger to Henrik because he's also our podcast speaker for our 5th episode, where he shares a lot of insights and best practices about how to use data and market orientation to create a winning strategy. Now, our conversations were so fruitful that we have to actually bring in Henrik for the 2nd episode. And this episode, we're going to go through a little bit deeper into several myths that we believe our target audience are also curious about. So before that, hello, Henrik. Welcome to join us again.
Hi, Julie. And thanks for inviting me back. It's a pleasure to be on the podcast with you again.
Yeah. In our last conversations, right, you mentioned to me something that we actually didn't get to cover. You shared that you actually talked to quite a number of business owners. So I am personally curious, right, as a business owner myself, what are the insights that you can share with us after so much conversation around business owners, around what's their view around marketing?
Yeah. Yes, I do get or have the opportunity to join. I try to join as many opportunities I can to meet with business owners. I think there's a couple of things that I've observed is that they generally feel, or generally they often do not have a marketing background, and they often have a lot of question, a bit of frustration sometimes with marketing, where they feel like it's a very cluttered world where we in marketing we talk about a lot of things that doesn't always make a lot of sense to how they think about business. So that's one observation, is that just they feel like marketing is a really cluttered space, and we talk about a lot of new things. Marketers, we talk about new shiny tools, a new way of doing things. And then the second part is the question I get almost always is, so how can marketing help grow our business? And a lot of times they have already invested in marketing, right? So they have been doing things maybe for a long time, and they often feel like they don't really see the results that they were hoping for. And again, it's usually focused around how do we grow the business? How do we bring value to the business? So I think today maybe we can talk about that. I'd love to share more about that, but I can discuss like why is it that, they have at least have the perception that marketing is not working. And I think very often it has to do with the not understanding how marketing brings value. And of course, also sometimes maybe marketing is not doing what we should be doing, but I think very often it's just that we, as marketers, we're not good at explaining in the language and the terminology that business owners and also very often finance use to determine business value.
Yeah. I can see how that two things is what a lot of business owners may find hard to grasp, especially when they don't have a marketing background, right? So I'm very interested to go into the second question, like the second insights that you mentioned, like, so how to grow business with marketing, right? So in our just now, before we joining in the podcast session itself, you mentioned a couple of things that if we can simplify the marketing concepts, right? On how do they actually help to grow the business? Can you talk a little bit more about that part?
Yeah, sure. So I think if you had to put the hat on as a business owner or as a CFO or a finance person, right? When they look at on value, what they're usually looking for is growth in the terms of, revenue growth, entering new markets, market penetration, winning a high percent of the existing market. So growth is typically one bucket they're looking at. The second one is profitability or margins. How do we either retain or maintain our margins? Or how do we increase our margins? Right? Those are the two things they're usually looking for. And another way of breaking it down is to look at what you can say is the reach of your company. How do we increase the reach? That means how do we reach more customers? How do we get more consumers, customers, buyers to buy our products or use our services? And then the second part is around, basically you call it sell more. How do we expand the wallet? So once we get a customer, how do we get them to, how do we get to keep them? And how do we get them to buy more products? And like I said, the third one really is the margins. How do we maintain healthy margin for our products, right? And I think the good news is there, or maybe not so much news, but like the good story that marketing can actually help on all three, right? So we are well positioned to help with both growth, but also with margins. And I think the main area where marketing can help is really around building the company's brand, right? So, and again, this is, I think, both consumer and also B2B. So I think most of my experience actually is in B2B, right? But for B2B brand also, like there's a lot of value in strengthening your brand, right? A stronger brand means, you can reach more people will know your brand, more people will consider your brand, but also a strong brand typically also can demand higher premiums, higher pricing. So that's where I think we as marketers, we can figure out when we talk about this. So even though we are working on social media or digital or events, we need to figure out how do we tie the conversation back to what we do in terms of value, to how do we help the companies reach more, sell more, and increase margins.
There is also a lot of times that I heard marketers saying, I really want to grow the brand because I see that as a sustainable way to grow. But my direct report or my business owner actually are impatient, and actually keep on asking me about how does marketing drive growth in this month, in next month, in this quarter. So I find myself, marketers may sometimes find themselves only available to the short-term techniques. What's your view on that?
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think that's very common in companies, and I think in the last couple of decades also, I think we've seen that shift where I think as marketers, we have kind of seen that, okay, we need to justify the ROI of what we're doing, right? And the easiest way to do that very often is to focus on activities that typically has a very short-term ROI, right? So that means we focus more and more on the language I think we often use is demand gen, lead gen, performance marketing, right? Things we can measure this month, this quarter, and say, look, we spent, $50,000 this quarter on performance marketing, and these are the leads we got back. They are in the pipeline now, so hence this is our ROI on this. So I definitely agree that is a trend and has been a trend. I think, and we can cover that today also here, right? I think when you talk to business owners, I think if you explain some of this concept around why it's important also to invest in your brand, they do actually get it. I think very often we're just not very good enough at explaining it as marketers, right? So I think they do see the value of the brand. When you ask business owners, don't you want your brand to have a famous brand, a trusted brand? They absolutely do, right? And same when you talk to finance, they also see the value of brand. I think one way to explain this is to use the sales funnel or funnel. So whether you like it or dislike the user funnel, but the funnel actually is a very good way to illustrate this, right? Where typically you have the funnel where you have awareness, preference, awareness, consideration, preference, and buying, and then you add loyalty at the end, maybe. Right, but you could say again, if you kind of illustrate saying like, if nobody knows your brand, well, that means nobody's going to be, considering your brand, and in the end, very few people is gonna buy your brand, right? So I think illustrating that, putting some numbers in place and saying right now, only 2% of the market knows about our brand. That means we are kind of limited to a very small piece of the overall market. And I think the other thing also we can use is around price premium. Very often when you don't have a strong brand, you very often have to discount your pricing to get the deal, which again is not ideal, right? Because you are looking to increasing or earning higher margins to create a profitable business. So I think those are some of the ways to explain it. But I'm happy to also, we can kind of go into that also a bit later to kind of find other ways to kind of illustrate why it's important to build your brand awareness and your strength of your brand.
Maybe if this is a good time, we can also go into it now. Like, how do we know when is the right time for us to start investing in building brands? And when we say investing brands, I think a lot of people wouldn't necessarily disagree, but there's also the questions around like, other than how much to invest, when to invest, and what exactly does investment in brand entails?
Yeah, good question there. So I definitely, like I said, like when I've some of the talks I've been to and meeting business owners, sometimes I do meet with business owners who are startup founders who are just very early stage in their business, where they are still kind of exploring their business model. They still haven't figured out, whether we are this kind of company or that kind of company, right? So at that point, I would say it's probably a bit too early to put too much effort into, building a brand. Doesn't mean you can't do something. You still need to figure out, of course, test the market and try and get some customers to prove your business model. But I probably wouldn't put in a lot of investment into building brand, because brand building does take time. It's not something you build over a quarter, right? It's a year-long, multi-year, sometimes multi-decade investment you need to build on, right? But then to the other point also, like if you never get started, then you never get there. But if you're really that early stage and you're still in that phase where you're still exploring different business model, it's probably a little bit too early, right? So if I can find another way of kind of putting that out, you say like, think of yourself when you are young, but like we've been a bit late, but for young people maybe who are still in their early, like in their teens and 20s, trying to figure out what do I want to be in life, right? It's like it also comes to define your own brand. Am I going to be a lawyer? Am I going to be a doctor? I'm going to be a professional football player. I don't know whatever your ambitions might be, right? But when we're young, we're still trying to figure out who we're going to be, right? And I kind of see that's the same as an early stage startup. Sometimes we have one idea of how the product can be used, but then as we start talking to customers, we figure out actually it can also be used in a totally different way. And we figure out that actually our business is not really in the analytics space, it's in something else. It's in the data cleansing space, maybe, right? So that's kind of like the same when you're young, you're still trying to figure out who you are. Once you've kind of determined, okay, I'm going to be a lawyer, then you can start investing in getting the right education, building the right networks, buying the right clothes to be a lawyer. I don't know, right? But before you make that decision, it's probably a bit too early. So that's kind of like a different way to kind of explain like early stage. So once you've kind of identified what I would call your deliberate strategy, this is the market I'm going after, and you have checked that there's a good size of market, then you can put a more deliberate strategy and budget in place to go after that market.
Got it. And once say a company already identified that they are in that space, what would you suggest they kickstarted to invest in brand awareness? And how would that differ with a more matured company?
Yes, I think actually the way I would look at it is to say, so like when I talk to my clients and they come to me and say, like, how do we grow? I normally look for what are the barriers to growth, right? So of course it varies, but typically, and it's very often, even if you are a startup with some maybe a couple of years of experience and you are an established mid-sized company, but you haven't really invested that much before, typically I'll say there's a common theme around what are some of the barriers, right? So typically it's brand awareness. Nobody knows you exist, right? So you build a fantastic product or a fantastic service, but nobody knows you exist, so nobody's calling you, right? So how do we get the world to know that we're actually out there? We have a solution to the problem. The other challenge could also be that we are just not available. So maybe our product is not available to those customers in the form of, we can't sell this product in that market or those set of customers, right? So how do we make the product available? And that could be both in terms of packaging, distribution, pricing, right? So how do we fix that? But I would say in most cases when I talk to companies, and also like I said earlier, most of them have already tried something, right? So usually they have already on Google doing their Google ads. They have already maybe done some events. They have maybe some telemarketing people doing telemarketing for them. They typically already tried that. So typically the challenge really is that there's just not enough people, and it's back to the reach. They're just not reaching enough people, right? And also the second one is nobody knows or nobody trusts that brand, right? So if you don't know a brand, very often it feels very risky to buy a new brand. So I think those are typically the barriers. So then you could break that down and say, how do we remove those barriers? So that means, how do we increase brand awareness? How do we increase the brand consideration? And also, how do we capture more of the demand? So I was thinking this morning, and also part to like, why do people not invest in brand? I think also part of the reason is also sometimes even as marketers, we maybe don't have an accurate understanding of how advertising actually works, right? I see this quite a lot. There's a belief that if we just run a campaign, if you push out a campaign, whether that's an ad campaign or an email campaign, then it will persuade people to buy our product. But when you think about it, and also if you look at all the research that's been done, that's not really how advertising works, right? Or promotion works. I mean, sure, like you can have examples where you show an ad and somebody sees your ad and say, okay, I need to buy your ice cream or I need to buy your product, right? But in general, that's not how advertising works. And to kind of illustrate it, we can take an example, right? So I think a couple of weeks back, I had to ship a package from Singapore to London. And I had to make sure it got there the next day. So it has to be an express delivery. And then to make sure that it was there and I would know that, it's on its way, I want to be able to track the package, right? Yeah. So then you say, now I have a job to be done. I need to ship a package somewhere. So already, as soon as I kind of had, I knew I had to do this, I already had a few options in mind. One of them was DHL logistics, because I've used them before, but also because I knew that brand. And in my head, right, I kind of knew that they do express, and I also knew that they do tracking. So already now you could say, as soon as I have that need, I kind of in my mind already knew one option at least I had, right? Sure, then I went to Google to search, right, to look for their website. And also when I search, I can see like in the Google search, there's a few other companies that come up. I can't remember the names. It was Just Express and Express. Like there was a few other options, but these are not brands I know. Like, so you could say like, would I click on them? Maybe it was a brand I have seen before. I might consider it, but these are brands I've never heard of before. So would I take the risk of putting my package with somebody I never heard before? Maybe. Sometimes maybe I do. But most likely we go with the brand we would know, which I did in this case, right? So you could say, here the brand is really powerful because, it could have been another brand, right? But like, because I knew the brand, and I think that all the research we have, I think there was some LinkedIn reports also a while back that says most, at least in case of B2B buyers, most B2B buyers, when they start their buying journey or their buying research, they typically already have 2 to 3 brands in mind before they even start researching. And at the end, 90%, I think it was, of those B2B buyers end up buying from one of those 3 brands. So that means if your brand is not one of those brands, your chances of getting that deal is quite small, right? And that's really the challenge for small brand is if nobody knows us. And even if they get to see our ads, they're less likely to click on it, less likely to respond to it because we're just not a known, familiar brand. So you could say, if I go back to the argument before when you say, okay, but if ads really work by persuading people to buy, then you would think if you showed me an ad today, right? If I see an ad today that says we can ship packages to London, would that persuade me to buy? The answer is no, right? Because I don't have a job to do anymore. My packages are being shipped. So right now I don't have a need. So you can't really persuade me to buy anything, right? So maybe we say, okay, but then if I show you the ad, maybe you remember my ad next time. But again, all the research shows that typically, especially with sales promotion, and I would consider most Google ads or any other search engine or advertising, if it's very sales promotion, we have a tendency as buyers to kind of ignore those, and they're not very effective in terms of generating brand memories, right? So which is what we need to do to generate a brand awareness and brand consideration. So what we kind of can learn from that is that advertising really goes back to the main purpose of brand advertising is to create brand memories, so that next time I have a need, then hopefully the brand memory will come up and say, okay, you need to use brand X to do this. So it's both about creating brand awareness, but also not just awareness, because I might know the brand, but also linking my awareness or my brand memory to this specific buying situation.
I like this idea of thinking a lot, because a lot of times we measure the ads that we put out directly to the bottom of the funnel of how many leads it got us. But it is also, in your case, going through the examples that you mentioned, how do I measure brand awareness and the brand memories that the ads have successfully created for the audience? Because technically, it will bring me more leads in the future. It's just not now. So it feels like a chicken and egg issue that we kind of have to balance between, in cases where it doesn't actually get us leads, how do I know my ads is actually working when it comes to brand awareness and creating brand memories for me to keep justifying the investment?
Yeah, so I think another probably the biggest challenge for brand marketers or marketers or brand managers is how do we justify this? How do we know it works? Right. And I think that's also back to what we talked about earlier, right? That's the reason why often we kind of fall back on just keep doing more performance marketing, keep doing more things that where we can show the results right now. And because it is difficult to show the impact of building brand, because it's not something you don't just show a couple of ads this week and then only you have the brand awareness. It takes a really long time. And even if you can measure part of this, you can there's some indicators you can use to say, like, is this working or not? But again, they move very slow. So it's almost like, you can look at things like your direct web traffic, like do more people come to your website? That's one indicator. But again, especially for small brands, the impact of the change will be so little that you probably won't see a difference in that quarter, right? So I think the first step here is when you work with your finance team and with your business owner, you need to kind of set expectation here that it's not something you don't become Nike or Salesforce overnight, right? It takes a long time to do this. There are ways you can track this. Like I said, you can look at things like direct web traffic, but again, you need to monitor it over a longer period of time. If you have budget, but again, for smaller brands, that's typically too expensive, is to invest in brand tracking surveys, panel surveys. Again, for small brands, I'm not a big fan of it because the volume is so low, so it's really hard to get accurate data on it. So it's something you need to kind of set expectation that it takes a while to build that. Over time, and we're talking probably a year, you will start seeing improvements. And then once you start over multiple years, you will start seeing improvement, right? But like setting the right expectation up front that, hey, we're going to invest some money here and then you won't see the results right now. Usually when you explained it, in my experience, like finance business owners, they do understand this, right? So we just need to be setting the right expectations. And then I think then finding some metrics, we feel like we can say over time, we will monitor these and make sure that we're seeing progress. I would say it is a challenge also because like I said, building a brand is not easy, right? There's a lot of different variables, both in terms of like, are you reaching the right audience with whether that's ads or events? There's multiple ways you can do this. But even if you're running, let's say you're running a advertising campaign, how do you know that people actually see your ads, right? I think although we were promised something very differently in, what was that, a decade or two ago with digital ads were supposed to be easy to track and all this, right? But I think what we're seeing now is that actually even though you can measure impressions and all these things, it's, you don't actually know if people have actually seen it. So you could talk about attention. Did you actually capture people's attention, right? So I definitely acknowledge that, yeah, it's a difficult thing to track, but there are ways to do it, I'll say. But the first thing is to set the right expectations up front. In my experience, like I said, you will see it. And also, I was saying, we call it a misconception sometimes, is that brand advertising doesn't generate any leads. Actually, in my experience, that's not true. We do see leads also coming from brand advertising. When I say brand advertising, it doesn't always have to be advertising. I say there's many ways you can build your brand. It can just be, being at the right events, finding other ways of reaching out to your target audience. You're definitely right that it's setting the right expectations there, so that people just say, hey, you spent 50,000 on this and it didn't yield any results, so maybe we should stop doing it. And I think that's very often is the challenge, is that we do these bursts of advertising, and then we say, okay, now we've done it last quarter, we don't have to do it more this year. But actually, all the research shows you this needs to be a consistent approach. So when you do this, you need to look and say, how do we spread the budget out so that it's not a stop thing, but it's something we run continually.
Yeah. Talking about spreading the budget, do you have any techniques that you can share with our audience on how to spread the budget in this case? I think just now you mentioned using the sales funnel to illustrate. I can imagine you probably may also use one idea on top of my mind is using the sales funnel to also illustrate spreading the budget. I'm curious, what's your point of view? Would that be?
So I don't think there's a correct ratio whether you should spend 50% on brand building and 50% on your demand capture. I think it's finding a balance, or at least try to do both. Right? I've seen so many articles where people say either it's 80-20, 50-50. I don't think there's I think it depends on where the company is at, right? And I think, but I think the key thing is that you do both. I think one thing to consider, I think especially for smaller businesses where we don't have a lot of budget, how do we get enough coverage? So of course you might have to limit it, but I'll say one learning there is that it's better to get, it's better to show my ad to you once rather than, better to show my ad once to many people than to show my ad multiple times to a few people. So if you had to choose that, so when you work with ideally if you can work with a media agency that can help you do this, right? But you do the first one is it's better to get that first kind of attention on your brand than just focusing on a few. So I guess the goal there is to go for reach rather than more touches. And the reason there simply is once people have been exposed to your brand once, they're more likely to buy from you, right? Showing a smaller group of people the same ad 10 times, they might remember the brand, but you get a much smaller reach. So I think one way of stretching your budget that way is say, go for reach rather than more impressions. Right? I think, but that's unless you're really good at digital yourself, you probably need to work with a media agency to help you do this. And I think the other thing also to remember is that your brand campaigns typically are different than your sales promotion, right? So what we use typically in our performance marketing, the ad copy and all this, it doesn't work, right? So what is very sales promotion worked really well for demand capture. It doesn't work it's not very effective in terms of building brand memories. So you do also need to invest in coming up with a brand campaign. And again, one learning from my side is that investing in creating a good creative campaign is worth a lot, right? Instead of trying to create new campaigns every quarter, I'll say I'd rather spend a bit more on creating a really great campaign and then run it for a really long time. I know sometimes we as marketers, we get tired of seeing the same ad, same campaign over and over again, but reality is that most of our prospects, they don't think about our brand every day, right? So even though we are tired of seeing that brand campaign, the market is not, right? So I better spend a bit more to get a good creative campaign. And if you can afford to work with a creative agency to come up with that, and then just run it for a really long time. I mean, I've run brand campaigns for more than a year, and it works, no problem there. So instead of trying to keep coming up with new things, go with the same messaging. And also partly because building memory structures in your prospects up in their mind and their brain, right? It takes a lot of consistency. If we keep changing our messaging and we keep talking about different things, it's hard to kind of position your brand around a specific buying situation, right? So remember that it's not just about brand awareness. It's also around linking it to a specific buying situation. So you could have cases where, I mean, it's always good to have increased awareness, but if people don't associate your brand with a specific buying situation, even if they know your brand, they might not think about you in a specific situation, right? So I think the case study I read a while back was around Salesforce, right? Salesforce, really famous brand. Most people in B2B at least have heard about Salesforce. So you ask them, do you know Salesforce? They'll say, yes, I know the brand. So high level of awareness, but you may not associate them with all the things they actually do, right? So most people know them for Salesforce automation CRM. You might not know them for other things, right, around customer support or service ticketing system, right? So I know I used to work at Zendesk competing with them very often. That people didn't associate their brand with doing these things. So that's why it's really important that we link brand building with specific buying situation. So, but if I can go back to maybe like also like some of the observations, like when I go back to a meeting with business owners. So I think very often the feedback from them is that we have, like I said, we have already invested in marketing. And what I see very often, and also from my own experience in marketing, right, as marketers, we tend to over rotate and focus a lot on that bottom of the funnel. And we often see teams struggle with this, right? And we try all kind of things. We do content marketing, right? We package things up as content, educational content, even though it's full of marketing inside, and then we push it out hoping somebody will download that, right? We do, of course, like performance marketing, Google search, which definitely it's a good investment, right? But it only really targets the buyers who are in market to buy, right? Yeah. But we also see things like, if I just looked at my LinkedIn, like almost every day I get somebody contacting me on LinkedIn from somebody says, we can do your lead gen for you, right? You pay us $100 a lead and we will do your lead generator for you. I've tried this. It never works. I mean, to be honest, I've never had an experience where this works. They will send you some leads, but sales will just throw the leads back at us and say, these are not real leads, right? And so I think, again, it's when business owners come to me and say, we've tried all these things and it doesn't work. It's going back to the examples we used just before, right? If you're trying to show me ads or you're targeting me, whether that's a telemarketing campaign or an email campaign or content syndication, we need to consider, well, one key concept is understanding of, if your total market, there is people who are in market and people who are out of market, right? So like I said earlier, now that I have shipped my package, I'm out of market. I'm not looking for somebody who's going to ship my package. So you can show me all the ads you want. You can send me all the sales promotion. I don't have a job to get done, right? So I think that's the first thing also we very often forget, is that as marketers, we kind of forget that rule, and we kind of target everyone and thinking that, well, they must respond, right? If I just send them or call them, so then they must be, if my promotion is good enough, they will respond and come and buy our products, right? But really only a small percentage very often of the market is in market to buy, right? So if you are selling like in my case, previously, if we're selling CRM software, I think companies on average buy a new CRM software every 5-6 years. So if you say every 5 years, that means like every year, only 20% of the market is actually in market to buy something. And that means if you look at it on a quarterly basis, it's just 5% of the market would be in market. So we're kind of limited as a company in terms of how much we can sell this quarter, because that's only that small piece. And you say, if then my company selling to those 5%, if I'm a small brand in that market, let's say I'm at 3% market share, I would basically only get 3% of that 5%. So it's really a tiny segment of the market we can go after in terms of demand capture, right? So instead, and that's where the brand building comes in again, we need to focus on how do we increase the awareness around our brands to all the people who are not currently in market, so that once they are, they have a need, they have a job to be done, we hopefully get one of the brands that they consider.
Got it. I really resonate with the idea of we have to still advertise to the ones that is out market, because by the time they are in market and when you advertise to them, like you say, they don't have credibility and trust to actually put us into the consideration, and we will then lose them. You mentioned also in our previous conversations that if we only keep on focusing off the bottom of the funnel as our technique, we will soon basically be stagnant and has no way to move.
Yeah, and actually, I've been there myself, right, in previous companies where we were growing, but then, and I think the challenge sometimes as a marketer, right, we do great the first quarter, right, and we get some leads, we generate some pipeline. Next quarter, we are expected to do a bit more, right? So, and then a bit more. Every quarter is a bit more, right? At some point, you're gonna hit that plateau where just there is, you kind of reach if there's only 5% of the market out there, and based on the size of our brand, right, we can only, if we are at 3% market share brand, we're not gonna get 80% of the demand out there, because like I said earlier, people buy from brands they know. Right, so we will only get a small piece of that. So eventually you'll get to a point where even if you have the budget, you simply cannot spend it on performance marketing, right? So that's not to say, like, I don't get me wrong, yeah, like I'm a big believer in it. We do need to do performance marketing. We do need to have demand capture campaigns, right? But there's going to be a point where unless you invest in building the brand and reaching a big audience, you're going to hit kind of like a ceiling where it's just really hard to keep growing quarter over quarter, right? So like, I think especially in technology, like we've been asked every quarter to do 15% more than last quarter and then just keep going, right? So you're going to hit that ceiling eventually where it gets really, really difficult. Plus also, it's like, I feel like if you don't invest in your brand also, that means you are kind of constantly have to invest a lot on your demand capture side which does become quite expensive at the end. Whereas over time, over years, as you build your brand, then, people start actually coming to you without actually the need to do as much demand gen or demand capture. And again, like I said, we talked about earlier, you can charge a premium because you are now an established, well-known brand, right? So, so you do need to do both. And like, when I talk to business owners, I usually try and explain that to say, like, there's basically two things we need to do in marketing. One is that first bucket, which is we call it top of funnel. Some people refer to it as mental availability or brand building, but it's like, how do we increase our reach? How do we reach more people? How do we build brand memories so that people actually get to know and consider and prefer our brand? And then the other bucket is really the availability. It's like, once people are in market, we are super easy to find, try, and buy our products, right? So, and I think it's you need both, especially also in B2B. I know sometimes the feedback or the questions I get from business owners say, yeah, but we're in B2B, we don't really need brand building. That's something for consumers. That's not true at all. Like we do need both here as well. And I was just trying to think about some good examples in B2B brands that are doing this well. And it's because like some of the clients I've met, one is very industrial products. So you say like who cares about branding in industrial products, right? But actually within your category, like I said, we don't always all have to be a new Nike or Apple or famous brand like this, but like within your category, within your market, you should definitely build your brand. Right. And one example I was thinking actually, because I was driving home and we had some construction happening across the road here, was the brand Caterpillar or Cat. Right. So even if you're not in construction, I'm sure you've seen their big excavators or bulldozers, right? These big yellow machines down on the road, on the construction sites. Super famous brand, right? The Cat with I think it's a triangle on the brand, and they typically always, I think they're all yellow, right? So, so if you're in need of a new bulldozer or an excavator, right? Caterpillar is definitely a famous brand that you would think about, right? So let's say if you go back to these two buckets, right? So that's really a company done really well in B2B to build a famous brand. And they do really well in terms of using what we call distinct brand assets, right? You see them everywhere. Everywhere you go, you see these big yellow machines with the name Cat, C-A-T on them, right? Or Caterpillar. So they've done really well in terms of building that brand. And at the same time also, they've done great also in terms of their what's called the physical availability, in terms of making the product easy to buy and try. And not try, but easy to buy, right? So give an example, availability it's not just, you can say, the consumers you usually think about as when you go down to the grocery shop and you need to buy milk or eggs. The product is actually available on your shelf. It's easy to find, right? But in B2B, often one way to make your product available is through search, right? So when I go to Google search, I can find the product. I can come to your website, and it's super easy on your website to buy the product, right? But sometimes also we need to think about things like packaging, pricing. So you can say a product like Caterpillar. I mean, I'm not that familiar with, but I don't know what they cost, but I would imagine they are probably very expensive machinery, right? So maybe if you're a small construction company, you say, love to have one of those bulldozers for my next project, but I just don't have maybe $1 million. I don't know what they cost, right? But if you go to Caterpillar's website, you'll see they actually also do leasing, right? So if I just have a small project, I actually don't need to buy the machine. I can just lease it for my next project, right? So that's a great way of saying, as probably a smart marketer there who says that, how do we make the product, available to the customers in a way that so we can reach a bigger market, more people can use our product, right? So I think that's the last piece. That's the physical availability. Is, as marketer, how do we make the product available to as many people as possible? And I think the key thing here is, as for a brand to grow, you always need to look at how do we get basically more customers to use our product, right? So your brand size is basically determined on the number of customers you have, right? So you should always look at how do I expand that. So of course, typically we look at how do I get customers from my competitors, but you should also look at what you can call non-consumers, people who are not currently consuming your type of products. Is there a way for us to make the product available to them so they actually can use the product, right? And I think Caterpillar is a good example there. We say there's probably smaller construction firm. We say like it's just not available to us because we can't afford to buy or own such a product. But by making it available through leasing or rental, suddenly then I can actually also use the product. So now I can increase my brand reach. I can reach people who in the past couldn't use this product. Now I have increased my market, right? So as marketers, we need to kind of work on those two, the branding and the availability.
Sounds good. I like how you wrap up with giving us two key summary, whereby we need to actually have a balance of invest in brand, invest in mental ability, building up the brand memories, building a brand awareness, then the brand memories, and ultimately also invest in the bottom of the funnel to make sure the physical availability is there. That includes not just it is available, but if we do the pricing and the packaging right, we can potentially increase the market, as you mentioned, include a non-consumer and not just the competition customer in this case. This is definitely a very insightful episode. Henrik. I'm very, very glad to have this second round with you. I've learned so much more. And for the audience, if you like this episode, please make sure you leave a review for us so that other listeners can also have a better way to find this as well. Once again, thank you, Henrik, for joining us. And thank you, everyone, for listening. Thank you so much for listening. If you find this valuable, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Google Podcasts. Also, please consider giving us a rating or leaving us a review because this really can help other listeners to find the podcast. You can find all the episodes or learn more about this podcast at was.ai. See you in the next episode.